The Toronto Manipulator. Chapter 1. Seeds of Power. Winter in Toronto had that specific quality of cold that pierced to the bone, transforming Lake Ontario into a vast expanse of blue-grayish ice. It was on days like these that Elliot Harmon felt most alive. There was something about the brutality of Canadian cold that he found clarifying. It separated the strong from the weak, the prepared from the unprepared. From the 47th floor of his Yorkville penthouse, Elliot observed the city through the enormous glass windows. At 38, he had risen to the top of York Financial Group more quickly than anyone else in its century-old history. Financial newspapers called him the Oracle of Ontario, a nickname he secretly adored, though publicly he showed modesty when it was mentioned. "Coffee, sir?" asked Monica, his assistant of 7 years. "Please. And what does my day look like?" Elliot didn't turn to look at her. It was a calculated habit, making people wait for his full gaze. A small detail he had learned from his mentor, Professor James Kinsella of the University of Toronto, a behavioral psychology expert whose books on human influence had become Elliot's private Bible. The finance minister called again, third time this week, and the Maple Trust Board wants to move up the meeting to Thursday. Elliot smiled internally. Their desperation was palpable. Maple Trust, Canada's second-largest investment bank, was on the verge of collapse after a devastating accounting scandal, and they believed only Elliot had the credibility to lead the restructuring. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the accounting scandal had been meticulously orchestrated by Elliot himself, through a complex network of influence and manipulation that had taken 3 years to execute. "Tell the minister I'm at a conference in Vancouver, reschedule for next week, and agree with Maple Trust for Thursday. Tell them I've rearranged my entire schedule just to accommodate them." Monica nodded, making notes on her tablet. "Oh, and Dr. Sarah Chen called. She said she needs to speak with you urgently." Elliot's face remained impassive, but something moved in his eyes. Sarah was the only variable he couldn't completely control, a vulnerable point in his perfect system. "Tell her I'll call her today." When Monica left, Elliot picked up a worn copy of The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene from his bookshelf. The book was marked, annotated, and practically venerated. But for Elliot, these weren't just theories. They were tools he had perfected and applied in the real laboratory that was the Canadian corporate world. Chapter 2. The Art of Observation. 5 years earlier, in the dark wooden corridors of the University of Toronto, a younger Elliot patiently sought to build his network of influence. As a visiting professor of business ethics, an irony that often made him smile, he had access to generations of future Canadian business and political leaders. "Professor Harmon, may I speak with you about my dissertation?" asked a young student after his lecture on ethical decision-making in volatile markets. "Of course, Catherine." He knew her name, though she had never mentioned it before. In fact, he knew the names of all 87 students in his class. He knew their backgrounds, their goals, their vulnerabilities. Catherine Ainsworth was the daughter of the Vice President of the Royal Bank of Canada. Her father would be a useful connection, and Elliot had identified Catherine as his eventual bridge. Over the next few weeks, Elliot mentored Catherine with exceptional attention, subtly building unquestionable loyalty. He asked for nothing in return. Not yet. True sages of influence knew that true manipulation never looked like manipulation. It was just kindness, luck, destiny. On the icy campus, between the historic Gothic buildings and the modern glass skyscrapers that dominated Toronto's skyline, Elliot methodically built his empire of influence. Each connected student, each colleague he lunched with, each administrator to whom he offered free advice, all were pieces in a chess game that few realized was happening. It was during this period that he met Sarah Chen, a brilliant behavioral psychology professor who studied precisely the patterns of influence and manipulation that Elliot secretly practiced. The attraction between them was immediate and powerful. He saw in her a mind that could truly understand his, perhaps the only one in Toronto that could. Their relationship blossomed quickly, fueled by intellectual conversations about power, ethics, and human nature. Sarah was the only person with whom Elliot occasionally lowered his guard. a calculated mistake that he allowed himself, rationalized as a basic human need for connection. What he didn't realize was that Sarah was conducting her own study on high-functioning social manipulators, and Elliot unknowingly became her primary case study. Chapter 3. The Puppet Strings. At the headquarters of York Financial Group, in the heart of Toronto's financial district, Elliot had cultivated an image of a benevolent but formidable leader. His employees venerated him, the media adored him, and the Canadian financial world saw him as a stable genius in turbulent times. The transition from academia to the private sector had been meticulously planned. Using his contacts, including Catherine's father, Elliot positioned himself as the only natural candidate to lead the strategy division of York Financial Group. In 3 years, he had risen to the position of CEO, leaving a trail of loyal mentors, neutralized rivals, and superiors who inexplicably decided they needed to retire early. Now, in the Canadian maple-lined boardroom, Elliot conducted his executive team with the precision of a maestro. "The Vancouver market is undervalued," stated Michael Trudeau, his CFO. "We should increase our exposure there immediately." Elliot tilted his head slightly. He knew Michael was correct. His own analysts had reached the same conclusion 3 months earlier. But it wasn't the right time for this move. "Interesting vision, Michael. But I think we need to consider the broader context." Elliot stood up and walked slowly to the whiteboard. It was a calculated movement that he used rarely. The rarity increased the impact. He drew a simple graph showing a correlation between Vancouver real estate prices and Chinese monetary policy. "If we pay attention here," he pointed to a specific point on the graph, "we'll see that we're on the wrong curve of the cycle. In 6 months, we'll be perfectly positioned. Now it's premature." The room fell into reverent silence. No one questioned where that data came from or how Elliot had made that correlation. Confidence in his vision was absolute. What no one realized was that the real reason for the delay was the fact that Elliot was secretly organizing the acquisition of several key properties in Vancouver through front companies, preparing to profit personally when York Financial Group eventually made its big move. After the meeting, Olivia Park, the Vancouver-born operations director, approached him.
"That analysis on Vancouver, it was impressive. How do you do it, Elliot? How do you see patterns that all of us miss?" Elliot smiled with studied modesty. "Just paying attention, Olivia. All the signs are there for those who observe carefully." It was a non-answer, of course, vague enough to sound profound, specific enough to seem humble.
He had used it hundreds of times. People were always satisfied, feeling simultaneously inspired and slightly inadequate. "You should write a book," said Olivia. "The Canadian market needs more thinkers like you." "Maybe one day," replied Elliot, "when there's time." The truth was that a book would expose too much. True power operated in the shadows, not in the spotlight of the New York Times bestseller list. Chapter 4. The Web Tightens. In the elegant limestone house in Rosedale, one of Toronto's most exclusive neighborhoods, Elliot was hosting what the local press would later call the dinner of the century. A private meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister, 3 CEOs of the country's largest corporations, and 2 former governors of the Bank of Canada. Ostensibly, it was a dinner to discuss the country's economic future. In reality, it was the culmination of years of Elliot's planning, the moment when several threads of his web of influence would be pulled simultaneously. "What I'm proposing," said Elliot, as the waiters served the maple crème brûlée made by the Michelin chef he had specially hired for the occasion, "is a subtle but profound restructuring of how we regulate mergers in the financial sector. Not deregulation, Canadians are too averse to that, but a reinterpretation." The Prime Minister looked intrigued. "And this would specifically benefit all of us," replied Elliot smoothly. "The Canadian economy as a whole, greater liquidity, more innovation, lower rates for ordinary consumers." What he didn't mention was that his proposal would create precisely the regulatory environment necessary for York Financial Group to absorb the weakened Maple Trust, the same institution he had secretly helped destabilize. The dinner progressed exactly as Elliot had planned, with each participant leaving feeling like a key collaborator in a transformative vision for Canada. without realizing they were all pawns in a much larger game. That night, after everyone left, Elliot remained alone in his living room contemplating the illuminated city. His phone vibrated, a message from Sarah. "We need to talk, it's important, tomorrow 10 a.m., usual cafe." A rare feeling of unease ran through Elliot. Sarah had been distant in recent weeks. At first, he attributed this to the pressure of her academic research, but recently began to suspect there was something more. For the first time in years, Elliot Harmon felt something close to fear. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. The Quantum Cafe, with its large windows overlooking the University of Toronto, was Sarah's favorite place. Neutral, neither his territory nor her office. Elliot arrived precisely at 10 a.m., not a minute earlier or later. Sarah was already there, a stack of documents next to her matcha latte. Her normally warm face was serious, her penetrating eyes fixed on him as he approached. "Sarah," Elliot smiled, leaning in to kiss her. She turned her face slightly, transforming what should have been a kiss on the lips into one on the cheek. A clear sign. "Sit down, Elliot." He obeyed, keeping his face in an expression of mild concern. The right amount for a confused boyfriend, but not enough to reveal his growing discomfort. "I've been working on something for the past 2 years, began Sarah, pushing a folder toward him. A longitudinal study on high-functioning social manipulators in the corporate world. Elliot felt his pulse quicken slightly but kept his hand steady as he opened the folder. "Fascinating," he said, flipping through the pages. "And why?" Then he saw it. Detailed graphs of his own behavioral patterns. Analyses of his influence strategies. A list of important corporate events at York Financial Group, correlated with his previous actions. Even transcripts of some of his conversations clearly recorded without his consent. "What is this, Sarah?" His voice was perfectly controlled, but inside him, alarms were sounding. "This," she said calmly, "is the largest study on corporate manipulation ever conducted in Canada. And you, Elliot, are the main subject. Anonymous in the study, of course. I call you Subject M. You spied on me?" The incredulity in his voice was genuine, something rare for Elliot. "I studied you, with full ethical approval from the University for Behavioral Study of Public Figures." Sarah leaned forward. "But that's not all. Yesterday, I sent a more specific version, with your name, to the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions." Elliot's world momentarily stopped. The OSFI was Canada's main financial regulator, with the power to destroy not only his career, but potentially send him to federal prison. "Why?" was all he could say. "Because I discovered what happened with Maple Trust, and with Martin Reynolds." Martin Reynolds, the former CEO of York Financial, whose sudden nervous breakdown paved the way for Elliot's rise. What no one knew was that Elliot had meticulously planted evidence of financial irregularities on Martin's computer, after slowly destroying his credibility among the board. "Sarah, you don't understand the world I operate in. There are nuances." "Spare me," she interrupted. "I spent 2 years mapping every move you made. I know how you built your image of a benevolent genius while secretly destroying careers, manipulating markets, and exploiting regulatory loopholes." Elliot leaned back, mind racing, looking for a way out. If he could just buy time. "What do you want?" he finally asked. Sarah smiled, a sad smile. "That's your problem, Elliot. You always think everyone has an angle, a price, a weakness to be exploited." "Everyone does," he said. "No, some people just want justice." She closed her laptop. "At this moment, the OSFI is receiving my full report. The financial press will receive copies in an hour. It's over, Elliot." The icy feeling in Elliot's stomach intensified. He quickly calculated his options. Blackmail, bribery, escape. As if reading his mind, Sarah added, "And before you think of any drastic measures, I have copies in several places, with instructions for automatic release if anything happens to me." "Why are you telling me this personally then? Why not just send everything and let me be surprised?" The question was genuine. It was a tactical move he didn't understand. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, something like pity in her eyes. Because despite everything, I loved you. And I wanted to see your face when you realized that, for the first time in your adult life, you were completely outmaneuvered. Not by a better manipulator, but by someone simply willing to do the right thing. She stood up, placed a few Canadian dollars on the table for the coffee. Goodbye, Elliot. Our Chapter 6, The Fall. The following days passed like a slow-motion nightmare. The Globe and Mail's cover story, The Wolf of Bay Street, the rise and fall of Elliot Harmon, the formal OS5 investigation, administrative leave from York Financial Group, the looks from employees as he was escorted out of the building, box of belongings in hand. In just 72 hours, Elliot's meticulously built empire completely crumbled. Sitting in his Yorkville penthouse, Elliot stared at the city. His phone, previously constantly ringing, was silent. The allies he had cultivated for years had instantly disappeared. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police with an arrest warrant. Elliot Harmon, you are being arrested for financial fraud, market manipulation, and obstruction of justice. As they put the handcuffs on, a young detective commented, I'll never understand how someone with so much talent and opportunity chooses the criminal path. Elliot almost laughed. They really didn't understand. For him, it had never been about the money or even conventional power. It was about the game itself, the 4D chess of manipulating people and systems, the supreme demonstration of control over a world he saw as fundamentally manipulable. As he was led through the lobby of his luxury building, head down to avoid the photographer's flashes, Elliot saw a familiar figure observing from a distance. Sarah. Their gazes met momentarily. There was no triumph in her face, only a deep sadness. It was at that moment that Elliot realized his greatest mistake. He had extensively studied Robert Greene, Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, and all the great strategists, but had never truly understood the devastating power of genuine integrity, the only force his system of manipulation couldn't predict or control. Chapter 7, Revelations. The Toronto South Detention Center was a world away from boardrooms and luxury penthouses. In the small visiting room, separated by a plexiglass partition, Elliot faced his lawyer, Arthur Goldman. The news isn't good, said Arthur gravely. The prosecution has substantial evidence. We're talking about 15 to 20 years potentially. Elliot kept his face impassive. And my offshore accounts? Frozen. All of them. Even the ones in the Caymans that you thought no one knew about. A heavy silence took over the room. There's something else, continued Arthur, uncomfortable. Something you should know. He slid a copy of the Toronto Star through the small opening in the partition. The headline made Elliot's blood freeze. Hue of T researcher found dead in apparent suicide. The article detailed how Sarah Chen was found in her apartment, apparently after ingesting an overdose of medication. A letter was found, expressing guilt for her actions against Elliot Harmon and citing extreme pressure. This doesn't make sense, muttered Elliot, genuinely shocked. Sarah would never. The police consider the case closed, said Arthur. But there are rumors. What rumors? Elliot looked up from the newspaper, suddenly focused. That maybe it wasn't suicide. That maybe someone with much to lose from her testimony at your preliminary hearing ensured her silence. Who? Demanded Elliot. Arthur leaned forward, lowering his voice. Think, Elliot. Who would benefit most if you took all the blame alone? Who was about to lose everything if the full extent of the conspiracy came to light? And then, like puzzle pieces fitting together, Elliot saw the complete picture. For years he thought he was in control. The master manipulator playing everyone like pawns. But there was another level to the game. Someone using Elliot the same way he used others. The board, he whispered. They knew, all along. Arthur nodded gravely. Sarah's report mentioned evidence that at least 3 York board members knew about your activities. Not just knew, but actively directed them, protected by their position above you in the hierarchy. The revelation hit Elliot like a physical punch. He, who considered himself the supreme manipulator, had been just a disposable tool in a much larger game. I need a deal, said Elliot finally. "Witness protection. I have information that can bring down half of Toronto's financial establishment." Arthur looked skeptical. "After everything that's come to light, do you think anyone will believe you?" Elliot smiled then, a glimpse of his former self. "They'll believe the evidence. Sarah wasn't the only person collecting information all these years." From the sleeve of his prison uniform, he removed a small USB drive, as thin as a sticker. "The difference between Sarah and me? She trusted the system. I never trusted anyone. Your epilogue. The final game." 5 years later. The small cafe in Thunder Bay, Ontario, was the type of establishment no one would notice, exactly as its newest customer preferred. James Wilson, as he was now known, blended perfectly with the locals in his checkered flannel and full beard. No one in this remote northern community would recognize in him the man once called the Canadian Machiavelli by the financial press. After his devastating testimony that resulted in the conviction of 7 York Financial Board members and 2 high-ranking Canadian government officials, Elliot Harmon officially disappeared into the Witness Protection Program. His sentence was reduced, but his empire vanished. In the process, he exposed a level of corruption that shook the Canadian pride of financial integrity to its core. James flipped through the Globe and Mail, a small news item catching his attention. Annual Sarah Chen Memorial establishes new scholarship in business ethics. Something that could be mistaken for genuine emotion crossed his face. His phone vibrated, a number that only one person in the world possessed. The message was simple. "It's time. London awaits." James smiled slightly as he paid for his coffee. Although the world thought Elliot Harmon had learned his lesson and disappeared, the truth was very different. The Witness Protection Program provided something money couldn't buy: a completely new identity, a truly clean start. For 5 years, he had patiently built another type of empire, more discreet, more sophisticated, and infinitely more protected against betrayal. As he walked to his modest car, James Wilson touched the inner pocket of his jacket, feeling the familiar outline of the worn book that never left him, The 48 Laws of Power, by Robert Greene. This time, there would be no mistakes. This time, he would be the invisible manipulator, the ghost behind the scenes. The most valuable lesson Sarah had unwittingly taught him: true power never shows its face. As he left Thunder Bay heading toward the airport, one last surprise awaited in his car's glove compartment: a recent photo of Sarah Chen alive, on a tropical beach, dated 3 days ago with a simple note: "The game never ended. Meet me in London." And for the first time in many years, Elliot Harmon, master manipulator, supreme strategist, the man who believed he understood every nuance of power and control, was genuinely stunned. Perhaps after all, he still had something to learn. The end.